back in the late 2000s. I was in my early 20s and living happily for a few years as a broke expat in Berlin. One of my roommates, who was from the Palm, UK, and I were out, late-ish seeing a band play, maybe around midnight or 1 a.m. And afterwards we were headed home, walking through a relatively central but quiet part of the city, towards a subway station entrance. We were in high spirits after a couple drinks and a fun night out, not too drunk, just a little tipsy, and we were laughing and chatting, probably somewhat loudly, as we headed arm in arm towards the subway entrance, which was ahead of us down at the far end of a long, quiet street. It was late October, early November, and still warm enough for it to feel nice to walk outside, and the misty air hung in yellow halos under the streetlights. Just as a little gust of wind blew some leaves across the pavement in front of us, we both became aware of a figure walking ahead of us in the mist. From the back, it appeared to be an older woman stooped over, carrying bags in each hand, and walking with a very pronounced limp, sort of dragging one of her legs along behind her. We were speaking English and nearly about to pass around her on the sidewalk when the woman cried out rather exaggeratedly, in English but with a thick German accent, "Oh, help! Won't somebody help me?" She didn't sound frightened or worried so much as deeply demanding, and her tone of voice suggested she expected to be helped. My roommate tried to keep us moving ahead past her, but I softened and slowed down my pace. Because after all, this was an elderly woman, carrying bags late at night, and she clearly couldn't walk very well. I asked her what she needed help with, and she said, "It's my leg. Help me carry the bags. I live just over there." And she nodded towards an apartment building entryway a half a block up the street. My inner Good Samaritan instincts kicked in and I responded automatically, "Oh, of course we'll help you." My roommate seemed decidedly less enthused for some reason, but begrudgingly followed me as we each grabbed one of the woman's bags and carted them to the doorstep up the street. As the woman's face came into sharper relief underneath a nearby streetlight, I realized that she looked exactly like a witch out of a German fairy tale. Bent posture, a large wart on her nose, grayish-white, straggly hair, and she was wearing dark wool clothing with a hood. I was honestly taken aback by her appearance and nearly gasped out loud, but again, wanting to be polite, I pushed this to the back of my mind. Who cares what she looks like, I told myself. She's just an elderly lady who needs our help. When we arrived at her building's doorstep, the entryway door was surprisingly open ajar, but it was normal, all in the neighborhood we were in, and she pushed it open easily, suddenly seeming to possess more strength than she had had moments before, and leaned forward to hold it for open me so that I could go in first and she would be behind me. She gestured up a dark and dingy flight of stairs and breathed, "Just up the stairs, just up the stairs." I froze in my tracks for a second in the doorway as my tipsy 23-year-old brain tried to puzzle it out. Logically, the polite thing to do would be to carry the bag up the stairs for this woman, right? But then again, all the hairs were standing up on the back of my neck, and the building's hallway and narrow staircase, in the dim fluorescent yellow light, looked awfully foreboding. I could just make out a doorway at the top of the stairs on the right-hand side that was also slightly ajar, leading into an apartment. An air of intensely stale, musty smoke wafted down the stairs, and then there was the tone of stark urgency in the woman's voice as she urged me to step fully inside and get up the stairs as quickly as possible. It wasn't too far from the voice of a cartoon villain rubbing their hands together while hatching a nefarious plan, as I stood in the entryway, tipsily trying to weigh the very bad, feeling in the pit of my stomach against my lifelong fear of being impolite. I actually giggled at how absurdly horror movie-esque the moment felt, so much so that it couldn't be a real threat, right? It was too spot on, so I must be imagining it. Fortunately, my roommate, who had seen more stuff in her life than I had at that point, literally yelled out, "Oh, hell no," hooked her arm into mine, and pulled me out the door and down the street as quickly as possible. The old woman yelled disappointedly after us as my roommate whisked me across the street and down the subway stairs, back into the safety of a warm, brightly lit public space full of people. Once we had safely escaped, my roommate shared the two things that had set off definitive alarm bells in her head. One, she was certain that the woman's limp wasn't there initially as she walked ahead of us, and that it had only appeared as we got closer to her. And two, In her words, as you stood in the doorway, I suddenly knew that she had a creepy adult son waiting for us at the top of the stairs who was going to chain you to her bed. Perhaps it was just our fanciful imaginations. But I have always felt grateful to my roommate's instincts for keeping us away from whatever was at the top of those stairs. Years later, I still think about that night in Berlin. Nothing actually happened in the way people expect when they hear a story like this. There was no confrontation, no crime, no moment I can point to and say, this is where everything went wrong. We walked away. We went home. Life continued, but the absence of an outcome doesn't mean the absence of danger. In the days afterward, I replayed the details again and again, trying to decide whether I had imagined the threat. In daylight, the street looked ordinary. The building looked harmless. People came and went. There was no obvious sign that anything about that situation had been wrong. Still, certain details wouldn't let go. The limp that seemed to appear only when we got close. The way the woman spoke, not frightened, but demanding. The fact that the door was unlocked. The urgency in her voice once I was standing in the doorway. Most of all, I froze. I didn't want to step forward. I couldn't shake the way my body reacted before my mind had time to rationalize it. Even though I couldn't articulate a single concrete reason not to. I had been raised to be polite, to help, to assume the best. Walking away felt rude. Saying no felt dramatic. Part of me worried more about being embarrassed than about being unsafe. My roommate didn't hesitate. She didn't try to analyze it or soften it. She grabbed my arm and pulled me out of there, loudly and decisively. That's the part I'm most grateful for. People often ask me years later whether I think something bad would have happened if I'd gone upstairs. I honestly don't know, and I don't need to. Real danger doesn't always come with certainty or proof. It often shows up as discomfort, as a moment where politeness and self-preservation are suddenly at odds. It looks like a situation where you feel foolish for being afraid, right up until you aren't. And since then, I've learned to trust that feeling. Would have happened next, the one that tells you to leave even when you can't explain why. Because sometimes the most important safety decision you make is the one that prevents you from ever finding out what would have happened next.